Fáilte. Welcome to this third episode of The Language Question, Ceis na Tongain, a conversation about the Irish language and its history for anyone curious about their relationship with it and its role in our identity. Our guest in this episode is Tadhg Mac Dhonnagáin. Tadhg is the author of the Irish language novel Madame Lazar, among many other works, talents and accomplishments. While this interview was recorded in late 22, it seems fitting that we are now first airing it in March 2023, at a point when Madame Lazar is being published in Estonian, having been translated by Indrek Eels. This chimes perfectly with the views that Tadhg shares with us on his vision for the language and its part in his identity as part of a vibrant modern European one, carrying forward a tradition that is equally important to him. As always, I would really appreciate your feedback and would be eternally grateful if you would follow, rate and review the show. Please also be sure to sign up at thelanguagequestion.com/resources to get your free valuable learning resources and to ensure that you stay up to date with upcoming episodes, guests and to receive exclusive content. Anyhow, here goes with this episode. I hope you enjoy it. Gumine tú soltas. Tadhg Mac Dhonnagáin is a celebrated musician, writer and publisher. He is an award-winning screenwriter and the author of Misha Raftery on Fiador Focal, which won the Gradamo Hulawan in 2015. His novel, Madame Lazar, won Irish Book of the Year in the Irish Book Awards 2021, and he is the founder and director of the Irish language publishing house Futta Fata. Ahai Gakara, Gurav Mila Mahagurt Asukta Veling, August Fáilte is Fiharot, Erin Show.
Gurav Mila Mahagut. An awesome venture.
Well, we are so delighted to have you here with us today, Tadhg. What I would like to do first, if it's okay with you, is maybe go back to the start and your relationship with the Irish language, where that began in terms of growing up and so on, and maybe we might just explore your history with the language from there.
Yeah, sure. I grew up in East Mayo, in English-speaking East Mayo, but I think I have to qualify that and say that even though English is my first language, that it was a flavour of English that was very much influenced by the Irish language, because in my part of Ireland, the west of Ireland, the Irish language had been abandoned in the relatively recent past. And that happened, I suppose, gradually. It started probably in the years after the Great Famine of the 1840s, when people, Irish-speaking Ireland, which was a fairly substantial population at the time, like at the beginning of the 19th century, there were 4 million native speakers on the island of Ireland. And the disaster of the Great Famine got rid of almost 1 million of them who died in the famine, and 1 million other people emigrated fairly soon after the famine. A lot of them were Irish speakers, and in the years that followed, that pattern continued and was well established. And so there was a hemorrhaging of the Irish language, Irish speaking population. So, and then those that were left were focusing on preparing their children for emigration. And that was really one of the reasons why people decided to abandon the language, because I think their spirits had been broken. And I think they really bought into that kind of, colonization kind of agenda that happened to so many peoples in so many places all over the globe. This idea that, that the colonizer was the civilized voice in the world, that the language of the colonizer was much more superior and much more intellectually rigorous and all that, and that the language spoken by the people who were abandoning their culture was inferior, was of no cultural significance, and was actually, if anything, going to be a problem and a difficulty for them in kind of making their way in what was becoming the modern world. And when I was young, I got very interested in the Irish language as a teenager. And I remember there was an old woman who lived next door to us, who I was always friendly with from my very early age. And I used to call and visit her. And when I got interested in Irish, she began to kind of open up to me about her feelings about Irish, which was interesting. And she had a certain kind of a longing for it in a certain way. And I think there were certain things she wanted to say out loud to me that she had never met anybody else who was interested in hearing this stuff. But I remember particularly one kind of story she told me about the old people. So I suppose her father, grandfather's generation, perhaps, and the grandfather's generation would definitely have been native speakers of that old lady.
Mm-hmm.
And she said that the old people used to say, they had this phrase in East Mayo, what is now, an extinct East Mayo dialect. They jich ku u av, which would be kind of in the Irish I speak now would be jich ku u uv av, which is it's a nonsense kind of a phrase. It means a hound ate a raw egg. But the reason that whoever imagined that phrase put it together, it was kind of like, this isn't a language, it's kind of grunting, jich ku u ow. Like, I mean,
Mm.
an Egypt would speak like that. And that was really kind of a revelation for me. I remember, like, I was quite young, I was about 16 or 17 when I heard that story. And it stayed with me, that this was a way that the people had kind of assaulted themselves nearly into, culturally.
They were denigrating their own language.
Correct. Yeah, they were, and I think that's what happens a lot to colonized people, that they just kind of are they are persuaded that the language of their own people is inferior, and then when they abandon it, this is the worst thing that happens. It's not just a question of one generation calls an animal that gives milk bow, and the next generation calls it cow. There's an awful lot more to it than that. It's not only a language in terms of sounds that represent objects and things and ideas. It's also a language is like a bag of goodies. It's the repository of memory of a culture that goes back generations and generations. So when they abandoned the Irish language, not only did they abandon the words and everything that goes with speaking the language, they also abandoned the traditional rhymes that the language contained that did not survive the language change. They abandoned the songs, they abandoned the stories, they abandoned the traditional healing incantations, for example. They abandoned an ancient system of patronymic naming, which still exists in the Gaeltacht. Like my my neighbour down the road here in on Spidell, where I live, is officially known as Sean Onyachtan. He was an MEP at one time. Very, very nice neighbour. But a lot of people around here would know him as Seaneen Jojani. And, and and that is a patronymic system which goes, it dates back to pre-Norman times, because it was the Normans who introduced family surnames to Ireland. Before that, you had that system of, the individual's name, often the father or possibly the mother's name, and then the grandfather or the grandmother's name. And that's how people were identified. And the two systems live on side by side in the Gaeltacht. But in English speaking Ireland, that system would also have been abandoned quite a lot. Also the names of flora and fauna, and the particular kind of folklore about around those creatures of the earth which we share our existence. So all that stuff, and it was all kind of thrown away by people who had led themselves to believe that the language they were speaking was rubbish. And I have always felt that that's a tragic thing. And I suppose in my creative life, I have always kind of tried to do something about it. And not to. I've never been a kind of I suppose, an Irish language activist that much in terms of, I don't really get involved that much in kind of, what would you call it? Protests and that kind of thing. But I suppose I feel my input is on the cultural plane. That I have been involved in music, and I've been involved in the book world and the TV world and so forth. And that's kind of my contribution, and I think that's the kind of the best job that I can do in this area. And it's not just like I'm doing this for the Irish language. It's also that I suppose I got to the certain point in my life where it just was such a natural thing that I happen to be a creative person, and I happen to work in Irish, and the work is more important in a certain way.
Because I want to come to all of that, but I'm just so fascinated by that interaction with that neighbor of yours that you had as a teenager. And I mean, just first of all, those conversations, would they have been Oscoilga?
No, 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 they wouldn't. No, she wouldn't have been a fluent Irish speaker. I'd say she would probably understand a bit, like my own grandmother did. She would have a lot of residual vocabulary in Irish, like my parents did and do. Like a lot of the neighbours, like the people who have lived all their lives in Mayo, the older generation would certainly have a lot of those words that there never was an English equivalent for, so they just stuck to the Irish word, and a lot of structures, sentence structures as well.
Oh, completely. The idiom of Hiberno Irish. I mean, we would see the same thing here in West Cork, very much indeed. And so at home, was there any element of Irish, or was that a thing?
Not really, no, no. But I was sent to the Gaeltacht as, I suppose, maybe 16-year-old, 15, 16-year-old, 16-year-old, I think, to Cornamona, which is just across the border in County Galway. So it wasn't even that far away from where I grew up. And it was a slightly different part of the country. It was a lot more mountainy and hilly. But essentially, it was the same place, and that's kind of what struck me. It wasn't like a city kid who was, sent out into the country and for the first time in his life was kind of, breathing clean air. Now, it wasn't, this was my natural habitat, as it were. I was a rural kid, but when I was there and kind of, walking the roads back and over to the school where the classes were going on and various activities, you'd be meeting these kind of old fellas on bikes and, people making hay and, whatever, that rural life of that time. And people would stop to talk to you and all this. And they were all speaking Irish. And I suppose I just said, if things had turned out a different way, this is the way it would be at home as well. That was a powerful thing for me. And that was
And were you conscious of that as a young person?
yeah, I was, I suppose. I suppose I became, after those few weeks in Cornamona, and I became more conscious of it. And I returned home, and I suppose I just decided to make it my business to become fluent in Irish and to be able to speak it as well as those people that I had met, who were, they were ordinary country people, but they could speak two languages, and that to me was very impressive. I was also, I suppose, interested in general languages. I loved French at school, and I just love that kind of the way a language just opens another world to you. And I have continued to be interested in French all my life. Um, so yeah, that I suppose it's a broader interest for me, language and the various little connections you find between words, and that has always been a fascination for me.
And then how did that evolve then? So you became inspired from what I hear from you in your interactions with the Gaeltacht, your interactions with your neighbours, just sort of the language became something of deep interest to you. And how did that then, because obviously I think, would it have been music would have been your first creative outlet as you were growing up, or?
That's correct. Yeah, music. Yeah, that's exactly right. So I got interested in music. I became very interested in the music of Clonard, for example, who were a band from Donegal, a kind of a folky band, kind of a hippie kind of an image they had that was very appealing and seemed very cool and interesting. And they're Irish, even though their Irish was quite exotic to me because it was Donegal Irish. And lots of people you hear, oh, that's the thing about Irish, all the different dialects. But to me, that was actually an attraction, because like it didn't sound like the Irish you spoke at school, and but it sounded so authentic. And that was the same thing as. When I spoke to native speakers, it was different from the sort of Irish you'd hear from a teacher, but you just knew that it was so natural and authentic that was just the way they spoke. And it was the same thing with the songs. So I became really just interested in songs. I was interested in songs in English at the time and folk music in general. I loved it all, and we used to go to folk festivals, and so it was. I was singing more, singing English as well a lot. So it wasn't. I didn't become like a very purist kind of militant, nothing but Irish kind of guy. I just seemed it just seemed to be a lovely, you know, parallel thing that I could have in my life, and I suppose I still feel like that, to be honest with you.
And then would it have been the establishment of TG Cahir? Would that have been a kind of a significant? Because I think screenwriting is something that you've done extensively over many years as part of that. How did that unfold?
Well, that was okay. So there were a few steps. So then, when I left secondary school. I decided to become a primary school teacher. Um, I did that. I got a job, and when I went to Dublin, I just connected with an Irish speaking kind of um, network, as it were, which was also kind of very much connected with music. And I just spoke a lot of Irish in Dublin, I suppose, but I became more fluent. And so then, it was a 3 year course that time. I applied for jobs in the Gaelscoil. Like I worked in the Gaelscoil for a few years in Leixlip in County Kildare. And around that time, just as almost one of those random happy occurrences that happens in life, I was approached to have a go at becoming a TV presenter with a program for very young children called Zili No Douse. And the reason that happened was that I was teaching at that time. I was teaching junior infants in this school in Leixlip, and I suppose there weren't that many young men teaching junior infants. There still aren't. There aren't many men full stop teaching in primary school in Ireland, which I think is a real problem that nobody seems to talk about. But I think it's something that needs to be addressed. The gender balance in primary school and secondary school, but certainly in primary school. Anyway, I was teaching junior infants, which was unusual, and I was spotted, as it were, by this woman who. She was kind of an advisor for this TV show, and she also used to work with the Neenry, the play schools, and there was a play school in the school. She was out at the school. She spotted me with my junior infants, and her son knew me. And so between one thing and another, I suddenly got this phone call out of the blue from this producer in RTE. And it was like kind of like, for me at the time, it was like getting a call from the White House or something. There was somebody in RTE who wanted to kind of.
This is the big break. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it seems such a random and weird thing to happen.
Yeah.
But anyway, I went out to RTE and I had to go, and they were duly happy with me. And so I did that for a few summers. I used to record these TV shows, and I also got the chance to write as well, which I enjoyed very much, to write stories for the program. And that was my first kind of, I suppose, professional engagement as a writer of any description. I was paid for writing these stories, and it was a nice thing to happen. So then I got a book published around then. I got a book published by Ngoom, which was an adaptation of a Cuchulainn story called Fleabh Vicriú. That was the first book that was published. And then a few years later, I went full time with RTE. I left the teaching behind me, and I went and worked in RTE as a presenter reporter on a program. It wasn't a children's program. It was a program for adults called Cursi, and it was a kind of a catch-all current affairs, stroke features, stroke kind of culture program. And I did that for 13 years. And for the last 5 years of that period, the program was kind of broken into its constituent parts. And this were the years leading up to TG Cahir going on the air. And it was a program called Cursi Alina, which was an arts program. And I was one of the presenters on that, presenter reporter. And I did that for 5 years. And that was really a lot of fun. And it was also kind of where I really felt comfortable. It was that kind of intersection of Irish language and culture. And I suppose that's where I've always kind of made my my living in a way. Since all those years, yeah.
When did you make the decision to move to live in the Gaeltacht?
Well, around this time, we had been living in, was married and had three children at this stage. We were living in Inchicore in Dublin, and we met some fantastic people there, and we had a nice house. But um, so there were a lot of positives to it, but there were challenges as well. It was a difficult area to live in ways. There were a lot of social problems. There was a significant drug problem in the area, and I suppose uh, I always loved the idea of the children growing up in the west of Ireland. So I got an opportunity to leave RTE. It was looking back, it was a big gamble, a brave stroke, foolhardy choice, because I was then at that stage I was kind of walking away from my second kind of job for life, as it were.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
so, but anyway, that's what I did, and my wife very kindly, supported me in it. And we moved to the west of Ireland. Another child was born, and I was working initially as a script editor with Russ Naroon, which is it's a it's a soap, and so I had been before that. I had begun to work on scripts. I was developing a TV show for young children, which was based on a CD for children I had made. So there was a lot of that kind of stuff going on. And I stayed with Russ and Roon for a while, and then I went freelance, and I started to work more with a company called Gael. And out of that came a series called Afric, which was a kind of a teen drama, live action drama, which we did a few seasons of, which was really great fun. And I was working with a fantastic director called Paul Mercier, who still lives here in Connemara, and he worked with me as well as script editor on that show. So I learned an awful lot from Paul about story and about screenwriting and about just the general nuts and bolts of I suppose, visual storytelling and dramatic storytelling. And it was kind of learning by doing. So it was great. That's one of the fantastic things in a certain way about the Irish language is that because the pool is smaller, sometimes you get these really exciting opportunities that you would find it more difficult to get in English, maybe. And so that was kind of very much the case with Afric, and the, so I'd done that for a while, and that was fun. But I suppose the only thing was that we had four children. Wife was working as a primary school teacher, and we just needed, I felt I needed regular income. I wanted to be a kind of a responsible dad as well as a freelance artist, and so I began to look at the possibility of going into publishing because I had done a few once-off projects. Up until then, I had made some CDs for children. I had made two albums for kind of, I suppose, young adults before that. So I made some CDs for children of songs I'd written for in Irish for children, and I began to think of making sort of books and CDs, and that's what I started to do. And that's where the Fata, the little cottage industry publishing house, began. And over the years that developed, I started going to the Bologna Book Fair. I started finding books to translate into Irish. I started working with other writers and illustrators to originate original books. Started going back out to places like Bologna Book Fair and Frankfurt Book Fair and selling those rights abroad. So selling the rights of original Irish books to like China and Korea and something like 14 or 15 languages now. Those books have found their way into, not every single one in every single language, but, there's a kind of range of books in a range of languages. And that's been like a real kind of interesting thing to do. Because I've always seen the Irish language in that broader context, that why couldn't it be a world language?
Well, this is something that I have really wanted to kind of come to in talking to you, and I want to just maybe come to that in a little bit in a moment because of I think that really ties in, Madam. It struck me very deeply in reading Madame Lazar that was a contextual element of how you approach the language in that novel. But just in relation to Fata, because I think it's like this is just I found this fascinating since I started thinking about it. I mean, you've created this publishing house. You started it off. You described it as a cottage industry, but I mean, it's a phenomenal business now. But you must through that have a great sense of, if you like, the state of the language in terms of how it's consumed, particularly for particularly because a lot of children's books are being published, and how do you feel, or do you have any sense of just how, what the state or development of the language is like in terms of how you see books and so on being consumed by young people, and have you any thoughts on that?
I do, yeah. I think that things are improving. Uh, I think that I think Irish in general as a suppose a strand of culture life in Ireland has become a lot more mainstream in recent years. Um, I think there is a kind of a certain longing for it. If you look at the success in English of books like Monaghan McGann,
Mhm.
those books are really popular. I see he has another one just out now. The success of Derry Grifa's book about quite a quite an obscure topic in a way. It's about the poem Queen Artilera written by Eileen Duffney Connon, and that book was just hugely popular and hugely kind of
The ghost in the throat, is it?
Ghost
Or
in the Throat. Yeah,
yeah,
Ghost in
yeah.
the Throat. Yeah, that's really it won outright the Book of the Year at the Irish Book Awards. Um, it's so, and there was like this. There is a longing there, I think, in the Irish people for this language that was lost by the majority of the population, and you can see that as well in the growth of the Gael movement. I think about 8% of the school-going population go to these immersion schools, where all in the 26 counties, and I don't quite have the statistics for north of the border, but I do know that they're becoming more popular there as well. Uh, but the desire, the expressed desire of the population is about 23% of people would ideally like their children to go to a Gael school, and the government has committed to work towards achieving that number over a period of time. And you can see that in the consumption of books and in the consumption and the interest in children's books in bookshops, and the increasing openness of booksellers to books in the Irish language. So it's all uh, it's all going in a good direction. Certainly in terms of children's books, I think books for adults are a bit more challenging, but I think there's a lot of potential there as well. And certainly, you mentioned my novel, Madame Lazar, which came out, roughly around this time last year. And I think when you think of the size of the the core population of Irish speakers, the 75,000 people or so who speak it as a primary language in their lives every day in the home, and then there's probably another 150,000 who speak it quite fluently and but would speak it less than daily, and then there's a bigger group again who speak it fairly well. um, but since the book was published, it has sold 2,000 copies, which is not Harry Potter by any means, but it's very respectable. And I know from my interactions with countries here in Europe who would have a much bigger population with millions of people in their country, or in their language community, in countries like you know, Serbia and Bulgaria and places like that. And to sell 2,000 copies of a novel in a language that may be spoken between 6 and 10 million people, and a lot of those countries, is, a significant achievement. So when you look at it in context, it's very, very encouraging. Uh, and so that's something I kind of like to do a bit more of.
Well, I mean, first of all, I have to say I found that novel just, it was a huge breakthrough for me, because have been somebody returning to the language, learning the language, and have found my ability to consume, literature in the language has been very, very limited. And again, Madame Lazar spent a lot of time with a dictionary working through it, so my progress would have been slow. But I found that I found it just it was an extraordinary breakthrough for me to be able to read it. And first of all, I just thought that the actual story itself was just extremely. I just loved it. But it's a thing that, first of all, it struck me as a very brave decision to take, to decide to actually commit to writing a novel in the Irish language for the reasons that you mentioned, in terms of the fact that the audience that is there is quite small. And I mean, was that ever a factor in your head in terms of when you sat down to do it?
I tell you, it's interesting, Finning. It was an awful lot of that project of writing that novel was quite a personal thing for me, because I had spent quite a lot of years writing for the screen in various just TV, written some film scripts and various things, and I've learned a lot in that area, and there's a lot I love about screenwriting. But as well as that, it's a very collaborative process, and it's also a very money related process as well. And writing a script has all sorts of kind of practical ramifications. So, for example, you might have a character who's like driving around the country, and then the actor who's cast can't drive. So then you have to have kind of stand-ins, and there have to be all sorts of practical kind of changes made to make that work. I'm not saying that has ever happened to me, but that I'm just kind of painting a picture for you. So it's then you might have a kind of a scene that it's really crucial that it happens at night, and I suppose this happens in probably budgets which are on the lower end of the spectrum. Just maybe there mightn't be the budget to shoot that at night. So they wanted to shoot it in a in a hotel room or something. And so what I'm saying is that screenwriting there are a lot of compromises you have to make, and as well as that, there are a lot of people. There are a lot of kind of people who have to tick boxes around what you've written. So you have a lot of kind of voices telling you, it should be like this, or should be like that, or should be like the other. And a novel it's a simpler kind of beast in a way, because the technology, as it were, is much simpler. It's just kind of getting words down on the page, and then
inside the reader's head. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, you don't have to work with a cameraman or woman. You don't have to work with an art director or any of those things. And also, when you're writing a script, you're actually it's very kind of restricted. What you can't explain, how the character is looking around the room, or how they're moving, or you can't put in any of that stuff, because that's the actor's job, and the actor should be able to read your words, read your dialogue, read your very kind of minimalist descriptions of the space and so forth, and be able to give all that stuff, because that's their art, and rightly so. So as a novelist, you get to do that as well. You get to be the actor as well in a certain way. So I wanted to work in that form. I wanted to have all that kind of artistic freedom in a certain way. So that was really what I wanted to do, and I wanted to see if I could do it. And so I would just kind of get up early, like in the morning, and I would just sit down for a few hours, and I would belt at this thing. And it took me, a number of years to do it. I would rewrite on, I'd be going to Dublin for something or other, and I just got a set of noise cancelling headphones, and I would just sit there for 2 hours in the train, very happily rewriting something, and chipped away, and I got through it. I worked with a few editors, because I've always been very despite what I just said, I suppose I've always been very comfortable working with editors and interested in their feedback and interested in learning from them. So I did that, and then the time came to let the thing go and to publish it, and so it was very heartening to get all the positive reaction that it did get, and it also kind of proved to me, I suppose, that there is a respectable market for contemporary fiction in Irish. I mean, it exists already. There are lots of other people besides me writing contemporary fiction in Irish, and also historical fiction and all sorts of different types of fiction. But I suppose as just becoming a part of that community, I just felt, this is something that kind of works.
Well, certainly as a reader, still one that is only learning, unfortunately. But as a reader, I just have to say thank you, because for me, like, to be able to engage with modern literature in the language, it gives it such a, because obviously you want to go back and experience the older and traditional literature and so on, and that has its own kind of different challenges and there's different aspects to all of that, but it was just such a joy to be able to if you like, use a language that you hear all the time as this dead language or dying language or whatever, and then suddenly you're reading this modern work of European literature in the languages is for me it was a really, really fantastic experience. But talk to me about, in the book, first of all, there's that European dimension to it, which is you have it set across various European locations, and of course, I don't want to get into spoiler alerts in relation to the book, whatever. But you have it spreads across the history of 20th century Europe and the post since the war. And then you have that then beautifully wedded to the emergence of the story from Inishmore, and then again tying into the phenomenon that is the Irish language translators working in Brussels, and that new dimension of the Irish language experience that there's a growth area for so many people. How did all that just evolve as you were writing it?
Well, it evolved slowly, and it evolved. It was a question of trial and error, really. It just one kind of strand led to the other. I knew I had a character. It was based on an anecdote my father told me about this man in our part of the world in County Mayo, who he was kind of coming to the end of his days around maybe the 1920s or 1930s, and at the end of his life, even though he had always been, outwardly an English speaker, spoken Irish to his wife and his family and probably his grandchildren. At the end of his life, he became, he succumbed to some form of dementia, and he lost really the ability to communicate, in a cogent way with people. But he continued to speak. But what he was speaking at the end of his life, maybe the last 6 months of his life, was all in Irish. And he had never spoken Irish all his life. His wife had never heard him speak Irish. This was surprising. And this kind of story lived on. And my dad told me about it. And I was fascinated by that anecdote. And I suppose, having put it in context, what I've told you earlier, you can see how, emotionally that really struck a chord with me. And I just wanted to do something with it. And I had written this other book about Raftery, who was from my part of County Mayo, and he was a wonderful poet and songwriter whose songs are still sung, here in Connemara, where I live. And I had really enjoyed working on that project, just kind of escaping into something big like that, and just getting into that world. And I wanted to do that again, and I decided to try a novel for the other reasons I told you, that I wanted to write something and have more control over it. So off I went, and I just began with that little anecdote. I decided that the character I was going to write about was a woman, that she had been born as an Irish speaker in an intensely Irish speaking world, and I decided that the Aran Isles would be a good choice, and that she, for some reason, something terrible had happened, and that she left under a kind of a cloud and ended up in another place which was completely alien to her, and that for the rest of her life she kind of pretended that she was somebody else from a completely different background. She completely sort of suppressed her memory of her background in the Aran Islands, of her cultural background, um, and of the language with which she grew up. And so, in a certain way, uh, you could almost see that the character was nearly like the Irish language itself, do you know, in certain way. But that's not really a significant kind of statement in the book. That's just kind of maybe a little echo there in the back. But yeah, so then I had this character who had left the Aran Islands and she ended up in Paris, and then when she grew old, this same thing happened to her as that this man that my dad told me about, that she was losing the ability to kind of communicate in French, but this other stuff was coming out, and she had assumed an identity. She had like passed herself off as a Jewish woman from originally from the north of Europe, from Estonia, and that was the story that her granddaughter had always learned. Her granddaughter, they had a close but difficult relationship, and because the granddaughter had been raised by her grandparents, and so the granddaughter is an equally important person in the story. So you have Madame Lazar, who's this woman who was originally from the Aran Islands, but that's a big secret. And then Lavanna, who was her granddaughter, who grew up in a Jewish community, a Jewish family, raised by Hannah, her grandmother, and by Hannah's husband Samuel, and so that's kind of, those were the elements I was dealing with. And so the translator, the Irish translator who was working in the European Commission, he was a kind of a bridge between the two worlds. Uh, so he was the person who was able to kind of help Lavanna, you know, understand these kind of clues that were emerging from the old woman's memory over time. And then I admire books that are kind of like polyphonic, you know, that you have each chapter is kind of, it's not in the first person voice, but in the third person. You know, it's, they follow very closely the view of one character. So that's the kind of structure. That's the approach I did when I was writing the book. Um, and I enjoy that kind of thing. So I took the opportunity to go back and forward in time. So some of the stuff is based in like the recent past in Paris and in Brussels, and then there are chunks of it which are based in the 1930s, 1940s in the Aran Islands.
Absolutely, and I love also there's a beautiful critical moment in the book that turns on a very subtle um, uh, distinction of pronunciation of a particular word,
Yeah,
even between two very closely geographically located areas, and how immediately one person would know, well, that person must have come from there because that's the way they pronounce that particular word, and it's
yeah.
a beautiful connection. Um, but the something that just struck me really, and is that you, and I want to just maybe tie back to Raftery as well in a moment, but just the national folklore collection seems to me to be kind of deeply sort of, a lot of what's in the book seems to come from that. Is that correct?
Well, not necessarily directly, but
Mm-hmm.
maybe just to for the listeners, we'll explain that a little bit. So,
Mm-hmm.
so some of the story is set in 1937, which was, this is young Madame Lazar's youth, when her name was
Mm-hmm.
Muret Ní Yuran, and she was an island child, from Oran, the biggest of the three Aran Islands,
Mm-hmm.
and she was raised by a widowed father, um, who was a storyteller, and his storytelling was of great interest and great pride to this little girl, who was herself. You could see that she also had a talent for this, for memory, and for collecting these stories that she had picked up from her dad. And this is something that was intensely interesting to her. And she also, I suppose, you see over the various chapters that she has an ambition to be herself a storyteller one day, to be a kind of a repository of the memory of her people. And a cruel kind of twist of fate, means that doesn't actually happen in the end. So I suppose the big kind of questions in the book they're about memory, and they're about identity, and about the relationship of memory with identity, and about I suppose religious belief. And I'm very interested in religious belief and religious ritual. I grew up in quite a religious home. I wouldn't consider myself religious now. I wouldn't consider myself, a believer, but it's still something that is a lot of interest to me. And so as the book developed, and it's a strange thing. I didn't see this coming, but it kind of emerged over time in the writing and the storytelling, that the religious kind of belief and the grasp that the young child had on the sort of folkloric Catholicism that she was growing up with. I wanted to write about that because I just wanted to, I suppose, draw on my own memories of my understanding of how the whole thing worked when I was a child. Like this world, heaven, hell, purgatory, this whole kind of organic kind of cosmic system that was being proposed by Catholic religion, and also the kind of the pantheistic kind of nature of Catholicism. That you have all these different saints, and they're all like gods and goddesses in their own right.
And but again, and the stories that are being told, I mean, there's these wonderful tales involving, Christ in various different scenarios under limpet shells and things like this, and then of course Mairead is writing these and recording these, and then she comes into a very stark kind of interaction with the priest, because the way in which she is describing recording these stories is considered blasphemous, I think, in terms of how he reacts to that.
Yeah, it was the teacher. It was the teacher actually who.
Teacher. Sorry, my apologies.
Yeah, because the priest was actually that was kind of something I wanted to do with the priest. Was the priest was actually quite supportive, because he had been
he comes upon her after. So my apologies. Yes,
he had been a missioner out in Africa, so he had a much broader view. I think he had a broader cultural view. That was what I wanted to say with that character. He had seen. He had seen kind of indigenous people in other places in Africa, and he had that kind of broadness of vision that that this faith of which he was the representative could include all these elements, including these folkloric beliefs that little Mairead had, that the reason that a limpet, particular type of seashell, can stick to a rock is because of something that happened which involved Jesus Christ being chased by the Jews one day, and he performed a miracle and made himself tiny and went in under the limpet's shell. And then from that day on, as a reward for the cooperation of the limpet has since been able to stick itself to the rock. And there are lots of those stories in the tradition, and they're the little kind of human kind of imaginings of a fairly, illiterate or pre-literate society, because Catholicism generally did not insist on people learning to read the Bible. And this would make us like very different from the Welsh, for example, as a culture. There is a much more strongly established literary and literate culture in the Welsh language, because of the Reformation and of the role of the Methodist religion in Wales, and the fact that the language was the Bible was translated to Welsh, and it was read and reread by the people, so that they could read, going back generations and generations, they could read fluently in Welsh. And they also had this extra formal kind of biblical register in their language, which was an extra kind of corner, I suppose, of their linguistic kind of realm in Wales that we didn't have as Catholics here, because because the Bible was not read, and they would have had it in Scotland as well, in the Protestant islands of Scotland, where the Gaelic or Gaelic language would have been read by the people, and it was very much an important part of the religion. Catholicism doesn't depend on that. Catholicism is much more centralist. It kind of all comes down from the Pope, who kind of, down through the cardinals, through the bishops, to the priests and the curates, to the people, and it doesn't involve the people actually reading and thinking for themselves that much. And so that gives the people an awful lot of space for imagination and to come up with their own kind of ideas, especially people who, there wasn't much else going on in their lives, so there was there was no television, no radio. That's what I mean by that. There was no, there weren't that many outlets for their imagination, and folklore filled that void. And that's the importance of folklore in that culture. And it's, there are elements of that oral tradition which are still alive and well in this area where I live, in terms of song and all that.
Completely, and that oral tradition is something that is so critically important, because, as you say, there was well, we have the Irish manuscripts, but that was a very, very small community that could actually read or write any of that. So literacy as a thing, it was through English, I suppose, was where literacy derived from most of the Irish population. And so the culture, it seems, has come down through that oral tradition. Now, Raftery was a huge part of that, and maintaining that through song. How did you kind of, what drew you to that? And because that was a huge project for you, the Misha Raftery and Fyodor Focal, and then I think the subsequent film.
Yeah, it was actually the film that came first.
Oh, I see.
I grew up in East Mayo, and that's where Raftery was from. So I became aware of the existence of Raftery when I was a teenager, when I went to the secondary school in Tadhg Mac, which is about 5 miles from where I grew up. And the Tadhg Mac people and the surrounding area were very, very proud of Raftery. And the time I was going to secondary school, there was an annual Éagsha, an annual festival about Raftery in the Irish language, which would have been a fairly kind of, niche interest at that point, but it was there. And there was a school magazine, and there was always, an article, at least one article about Raftery. So I kind of became interested in him. I got to know a few of his songs. There were a few of his songs on the Intercert and Leaving Cert at the time. So this was like a cultural figure from my own place. There was nobody who had written in English who was a cultural figure from my own place, who was of national importance and was on the school course. So I always thought that Raftery was important and interesting. And then when I went to college, there was a play called, I think it was called Misha Raftery in Filla. It was written by Christopher Flynn, and it was quite an adventurous play, but it had a lot of irony in it. It kind of kind of juxtaposed the very romantic view that the Anglo-Irish people had of Raftery, of this kind of spiritual wanderer who was going around, writing his poems, and the actual kind of real tough life of poverty and kind of hand-to-mouth existence, and a certain level of drunkenness, I would imagine as well, that Raftery actually lived his life. So that was my first kind of I suppose meeting with a more real Raftery and a more human Raftery. And then I'd written a few songs about him, and I made an album called Raftery Underground and a song called Raftery Underground. It's quite well known. So then there was this wonderful director here who's done a lot of great docudramas and all sorts of things for TG called Sean O'Cooline. And he wanted to do, he grew up in the Kilkieran Corna area of Connemara, which is a place which is especially rich in traditional songs. So he would know a lot about Raftery, and his people would. And he wanted to make this kind of docudrama, and he approached me about writing the script. and we worked together on it. And that kind of gave me the opportunity to do more research about Raftery. I learned a lot of new things about him that I hadn't known previously, and to kind of really, I suppose, establish clearly in my mind the timeline of his life, about what he had done, where he had done, when he had done it, why he, and all that.
Could you just give, for those who may not be so familiar, just a very brief history, just in terms of where he, just period of time in which he existed, and just for listeners?
Okay, quickly. He was born in 1779 in a place called Kileadon, which is near Tadhg Mac in East Mayo. His father was a weaver. His mother was a local woman, and his father worked for a local landlord, a quite a benign kind of landlord, a Catholic, as it happened, a man called Frank Taff, who seems to have been, a very, quite a supportive person in Raftery's life. At the age of somewhere between 5 and 9, the family, there were 8 siblings. Raftery was one of 9. The family was struck by smallpox, and all the children died except Raftery, Anthony Raftery, the one child that survived, and he was struck blind at that age, and he was blind for the rest of his life. And according to tradition, Frank Taft, the landlord, took a great interest in him. I think he probably liked this young guy who was obviously very bright and kind of, had plenty of ideas of his own. And he arranged lessons for him to play the fiddle, because he could see that would help him, make a living and survive as a blind person. And then at some point before 1820, we don't know when, Raftery managed to move from East Mayo and ended up in East Galway, and he spent the rest of his life up until 1835 wandering the roads of East Galway, and he became, relatively speaking, quite a famous person in that little world. He became and had an ambition to become the voice of his people in a certain way, in terms of kind of, standing up for them in the political realm as a poet and as a writer of verse, who, in an illiterate population would have a standing and a prestige, because he would be able to kind of forge the random language of the people into this form, and he would be able to express in precise and I suppose artistic terms what was bothering the people. So he made a lot of radical statements about he supported, I suppose, violent resistance at a certain point to the oppression of the landlord class and the landlord system. He supported Daniel O'Connell, during a certain crucial kind of election campaign in the end of the 1820s. He wrote a lot of stuff, and he wrote one thing that is like a ribbon, or like a thread through Madame Lazar. He wrote a historical poem called Shanachas Nishkeha, which was the story of the Irish people since the beginning of time up until around roughly the end of the 17th century. And that was a poem that was learned and widely known by people in Connacht. And in a certain way, it was a kind of almost like a history book that Raftery wrote in verse to tell the people who they were, because nobody else was telling them. They didn't have an education system that would tell them. They had hedge schools and so forth. But this was like gathering all the information he knew, and it wasn't all historically correct even, but he did his best. And it was he put it together, to explain to the people who they were and to give them a sense of pride in who they were.
And is that the poem that Mairead's father is particularly, he's kind of that he's particularly adept at telling, and has the memory of that story?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. That's a little, connection between the two books.
Yeah. What I found, I found it fascinating. As well, first of all, I didn't know anything about Raftery before reading the book, and I thought it's just it was a beautiful telling of that story, but also the social history that it provides was fascinating to me, and the insight that it gave me to the um, to so many aspects of our society of that time. But for instance, one of the things that well, first of all, the power of the poet in terms of the possibility to curse or the fear that was there in relation to what a poet might do to someone was extraordinary. And also a thing that I hadn't been aware of was this idea that the idea that you must whenever you would compliment somebody or say something positive, you must bless the issue of blessing after that, or else there's a possibility that the devil may get in, and that could have very negative consequences. These beliefs that were there among the ordinary people. I mean, these were very powerful ways of understanding the world. We might look at them now as being quite primitive, and we say, "Oh, well, that's clearly, well, that pishogri or whatever it might be." But it was really, really significant and powerful for those people.
Yeah, there was, and I found out recently that that idea that if you praise somebody, that you should invoke God's blessing in case that particular talent that you have praised would in somebody taken away. Apparently, there's a very similar use of blessing in the Arabic world. So it's kind of extraordinary how those little kind of tropes of belief are global, uh, and that's kind of what's really interesting about an oral tradition, is that it's not just about a particular corner of Ireland. You will find when you kind of dig down is that it's a reflection of human life on a much broader scale, uh, and that interests me.
Well, it's fascinating to me because I've been reading a book recently, which is called The Expectation Effect, which has been looking at the science of a lot of this. And apparently, there is this really significant connection now between what we it's he talks, I suppose it starts with the placebo effect, and how the placebo effect can actually have a physiological effect in the body. But the same thing applies in relation to beliefs, and the book explores how this happened, particularly in relation to a community from Laos, I think, who moved to the United States, and a lot of them were dying inexplicably. Young men were dying, and it turned out it was because of a belief they had in relation to a particular spirit that they believed was coming to them in the night, and they would literally die, of their hearts would fail in their sleep. But the reason that this problem was occurring was they didn't have access to their shaman and their particular rights that they would have had to protect them from this in their indigenous communities. And when they reintroduced them in their communities in the United States, this stopped happening. So it was their belief system that was causing this physiological thing to happen in their bodies. And it just struck me when I was reading this, and I was then reminded of both the cursing and the blessing in Miss Raftery. How maybe that wasn't just pure pishogri. Maybe there was some kind of effect that was happening as a result, and it also made me think about the cures that you mentioned. And I mean, I suppose because I thought it was particularly poignant when you mentioned, just the way you described when the family were struck by the smallpox. It was a smallpox, I think. Would it
Yes,
have been?
yes, it was.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and how this, all that they would have had would have been maybe some herbal remedy or cures, um, and it seemed desperately pitiful that this was all that was there. But I wonder the extent to which you know those belief in those cures. I wonder the extent to which a placebo effect or something might have been in that.
Yeah, it's possible. It's possible. There were certain, but those I mean those cures, those incantations, they're very much part of the oral tradition here in Connemara. They would still, they're very well recorded, and they're available there in the collected folklore. And yeah, I made an album a few years ago. I made a few projects of traditional kind of spoken word material from the oral tradition for children. One called Googly Gog, which was became very popular. And while we were doing that, my musical partner John Ryan, who's worked on me with me in a lot of different projects, he made the suggestion: wouldn't it be interesting to do something like this for adults? You know, if you could find some sort of spoken word material, whatever it is. I said, I don't even know if it exists, but something like that, and then we could make another project like this, and I could, you know, build kind of soundscapes behind the voices, which would have a different kind of style, a more an adult friendly kind of style. And we did that. We made this book and album called A Year, Voices and Verse from the Edge of the World, and we included some of those traditional incantations, which would never have been presented in a kind of a performative way like we did on our album. You know, they would have been used as traditional kind of healing, you know, chants or whatever. But I just found it when I found these pieces of text, you know, these things that people used to recite or whatever. I just found that some of the lines were just very poetic, and there was a beauty to them, and I just wanted to do something with that to kind of to bring them back, to give them a new life, as it were, to give them to so that they would have a life not just, you know, in some library and some folklore collection in Dublin, but that they would be given voice, so that you could play them on the radio or you could listen to them in your car or whatever, so that they would, you know, that they would again be kind of, you know, brought back into existence in a new way.
Well, that continuation of that tradition is powerful. Tag. If we could just to maybe, as we come to the end of the conversation, one of the things that I mean, first of all, I think your contribution to the language, certainly for me as a learner, has been an extraordinary one and very, very powerful, and so welcome. Um, and um, and I love the commitment you've made to doing that, because it's, if you like, adding to the. I mean, there's a problem, I think, with the language on a certain level, in that you have, you know, people might say, oh well, you know, there's no point in. I spoke to somebody previously who wrote and they decided to publish in English because the market is so small in Irish, and you know, it's a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy if once if it isn't there, that you don't have the readers to come to it, but. Um, from what I'm hearing from you, I mean, in terms of your experience in publishing and in terms of your own experience in writing, I mean, it's quite a positive story, and there's quite a good news story, and there's grounds for optimism there. But what I have heard from speaking to others is that they say, well, look, you know, I don't have any fear of the language. I think the language will take care of itself, or, you know, that they will happen. But the big fear they have is of the Gaeltacht, and that they don't see that the survival of the Gaeltacht as or that's a big area of concern. What are your thoughts around that? You're somebody who's moved back. You lived in the Gaeltacht now for many years, raised your family there. I mean, what is your sense of that aspect of it, the language generally, and the Gaeltacht, and how are they interlinked?
Well, I think the Gaeltacht now, the context of the Gaeltacht now is a globalized culture. And we have, you know, the Gaeltacht has probably the most formidable kind of opponent, as it were, most formidable cultural competition on the planet, that is the English language. Because, you know, almost like much bigger languages in terms of, you know, critical mass of native speakers, monolingual native speakers, like say French, for example. I mean, the language, the speech of the young in French is just kind of, is just dotted with English words. I mean, and that is true of so many languages all over the world. So English at the moment, at this point, is really very dominant. So it's a particularly difficult, um, you know, challenge for a small language community and small language communities like the Gaeltacht areas to survive in the face of all that. And also the young, they're not so kind of rooted in their own geographical area as they were. I mean, a lot of the young spend their lives on Instagram and Snapchat whatever you're having, and their lives are not. Their lives are much more globalized, and their connections are much more globalized. Now, that has had, in some ways, a very positive effect on the Irish language. I can see in terms of, say, my own work in writing and publishing, for example, the fact that we can get our message out through the social media. We can connect with an audience in a way that you'd have to sit around and wait for somebody to write about your book in the newspaper one time, and that's still important. But there are all these other ways of getting your story out to people, like this podcast, you know. But also social media, that everybody can instigate their own kind of message and send it out into the world, and you can collect an audience for it. But in terms of the survival of a small population, I think it is a big challenge, and it's also got to the point where everybody has to make the decision, because everybody now has the level of English where they could comfortably just switch, as happened in my own part of County Mayo, and just kind of not speak Irish anymore, or gradually, over a generation or two, you know, stop speaking it. And I can see that could happen in Connemara. I can see that it's well advanced in West Kerry, from my wife is from. And I would have a concern, certainly, and I don't think it's useful to to avert my gaze on that. I mean, I think that's something that could happen. There are interesting things happening, though. Like here in Connemara, there's a fantastic organisation called Tadhg Mac Dhonnagáin. The parents of the Gael was set up some years ago by a voluntary organisation, and it now it's a well-funded organisation now with a full-time staff, and their interventions are really wonderful. They have a whole program events for families, and they've done a lot about like books and literacy, and they have all sorts of kind of cultural events, and they've just really given the language a lot of support. And the whole language planning kind of projects that are going on, I can see the positive effects of those things. There are more kind of opportunities, especially in the cultural realm now, to interact. Besides, like, I mean, the locals speak Irish in the shops, but you will find even that. You find when you go into a shop, say in Spittle, say I would know some of the young people. I'd remember them from when my kids were younger and so forth, and they would speak Irish to me happily, but they would speak English to each other behind the counter. So you see that's, and I'm not judging that, but it's a pattern. So they have the choice, those young people. What are they going to do with this language in which they are, pretty fluent, or very fluent, some of them. Some of them are going to stick at it. Some of them are going to, make that choice, and others aren't, and so it's hard to know, where Connemara will be in 30 years. I think there still certainly will be Irish spoken, and there will be certainly there will be a consciousness that it's a part of Connemara life, but it's certainly not as intense as it was even today as it was 30 years ago. There's no doubt about that. It's you have much fewer people who are more comfortable speaking Irish than English. We'll put it that way. And that's a staging post, or it could be a staging post on the way to, abandoning it completely. I don't think it will be abandoned in Connemara, but I think that it is certainly, it's a challenge to keep it going. But I'm an optimist, and I'm sticking to my guns, and I see a lot of positive things as well.
Wonderful. What could I ask you finally then, just to bring it all together, and thank you so much for sharing your story with us here, and your background, your philosophy, and your experience in relation to the language. But when I listen to you, you have somebody who started off coming from an English speaking area, obviously with the Hiberno English, kind of Irish was there a couple of generations ago, but English, there was no Irish at home, shall we say,
Mhm.
and you've now moved to a point where you're living in, you've dedicated your life to so many aspects of the language and writing in the language, creating music in the language, publishing in the language. What is your why? Why have you? Why were you motivated to do that? And what is your reason for the importance of Irish in your life?
Well, I suppose I find that Irish connects me in a profound way to the people that have gone before me. I think that that's in I'm kind of interested in in the religions of the world, and one of the things that religions do is that it connects an individual his or her ancestors, and you have that kind of sense of this of that they're an individual uh, who comes from a long line of individuals, and that there hopefully be a long line of individuals that will keep going and marching into the future. And it kind of gives me that rootedness in a certain way, and it gives me a sense of my people and my own little part in that. And even like the place names, I love traveling around Ireland. I love traveling around the world, but when I'm in Ireland, I love traveling around, and especially if I'm in an unfamiliar place, you will find that in certain parts of the country that there'll be a whole bunch of place names with particular words, like up in the border areas, for example. I'm from Ahamore in County Mayo, but there are a lot of Aha, which means it's kind of a literary word now for a field. So you have a lot of those Aha all over Cavan and Monaghan. Or in Donegal, you have Mean, which means a fertile little patch of land in the mountains, and all those little things, and they all have these kind of interesting images in them. Like there's a place outside Monaghan town called Achanashad, which may mean the field of the jewels. And I'm just like, maybe that's not what it means, but I think it probably does mean that. That's really kind of interesting to me. It's kind of like there's a poem in that, or there's a song in that, or something. There's a place outside Killybegs called Gortnamord, which means the field of the bards. And like, you're driving by and say, who are the bards? Like, and why do they have a field? Why was it there? Or there's a place near where I grew up in Tadhg Mac called Dhonnagáin, which is like it's like the quarter, in Paris, like the quartier, and you'd have that in English, the quarter, the like Anchiararua is the kind of the red quarter. You also have a third that so in certain places you have Antrian. Antrian law is the third, the middle third. But there's a place called Trian. It's called Trí Naglera now in English, Trí Naglera, which means nothing. But in Irish, it's Trian Naglera, which is the third of the clerks. And you'd say, who are those clerks? And why were they up there halfway up the mountain? Uh, so it's those like little questions that the landscape kind of poses at me as I, ramble around and I'm looking at these place names. It's a kind of a lovely, it's poetry, I think. That's my view of it, and it's all that kind of that just extra kind of awareness of Ireland that you get from speaking Irish. Um, that I love, and I suppose that's something that I wanted to always express that enthusiasm in terms of what I've written and what I've shared, and I also, because I just love the texture of the language. It's kind of like, writing in Irish. It's just like, painting in oil as opposed to painting in acrylic, or it's just like it has a texture, it has a feel, it's a different thing, it's a different sound, different way of constructing sentences. And just from an artistic point of view, I like it. It's like being a weaver as opposed to being something else. Um, so that's kind of that's my connection with it. Um, and it has been a very enriching connection. And I suppose I put it in the context of loving languages, and also, speaking other languages as well, and just seeing it as part of the kind of the tapestry of culture in Europe as well. I mean, I'm very interested. I've always felt that my my work as an Irish speaker and writer is much an expression of my European identity as it is of my Irish identity, and that's a really important idea for me, because Europe is a continent, a patchwork of languages and cultures and voices and songs and all that stuff, and that makes it a very interesting part of the planet, in my view. And Irish is very much part of that interestedness, if that's a word.
It's a beautiful word, and it's a beautiful way to round out this conversation, because I think oftentimes when people speak about Irish, it can come from, well, at least it can be interpreted or spoken about in an insular kind of closed kind of way. But I think the open European international way in which you understand it as part of the languages of the world is absolutely beautiful. And thank you so much for your contribution to that, and for enabling people like me who are trying to learn the language, providing us with such wonderful material in which to enjoy it. A haig a cara gur míle maithagad a bhain me ansalt as an scéal a rainn tú linn berbua agus bannacht a cara.
Gur míle maithagad féin. Bhí bhór an pléisiúr bheith caint leat agus gur míle maithagad faoin deis áil má scéal a rionsta.
Thanks for listening. Gur raibh míle maithagad as a bheith éisteacht. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I would really appreciate your feedback and would be eternally grateful if you would follow, rate and review the show. Please also be sure to sign up at thelanguagequestion.com/resources to get your free valuable learning resources and to stay up to date with upcoming episodes, guests and to receive exclusive content. Slán Tamil.